Welcome to the 24th episode of the Reading and Writing Podcast. I'm your host, Jeff Rutherford. Today my guest is Jonathan Maberry, suspense and horror writer and comic book scripter. Stay tuned for my interview with Jonathan Maberry.
This is Lee Child, and I'm listening to the Reading and Writing Podcast.
Welcome to the Reading and Writing Podcast. Tonight, my guest is Jonathan Maberry. Jonathan's first novel, Ghost Road Blues, won the 2007 Bram Stoker Award for Best First Novel. That book was the first of the Pine Deep trilogy and was followed by Dead Man's Song and Bad Moon Rising. Maberry's latest series, featuring Joe Ledger, debuted last year with a zombie thriller, Patient Zero, and his latest novel, The Dragon Factory, was just published by St. Martin's Press and is in bookstores now. He also wrote the movie tie-in novelization to the remake of The Wolfman, featuring Benicio del Toro and Anthony Hopkins, which just came out in movie theaters. Maberry is also a comic book writer and is currently the writer for Marvel Comics' Black Panthers series, and he wrote Marvel Zombies Return Wolverine, in addition to other comics. Jonathan, welcome to the Reading and Writing Podcast.
Happy to be here, Jeff.
Sure. Well, I'm curious if someone hasn't read one of your Joe Ledger novels, Patient Zero and now The Dragon Factory, what can they expect with The Dragon Factory? Can you give us a sense of what the novel's about?
Yeah, if you can imagine a kind of a cross between X-Files and 24. The bad guys in this particular story are two competing groups of geneticists who are using cutting-edge transgenics to create a new version of the Nazi master race program, and also for ethnic cleansing. And the group that's opposing them, Joe Ledger and the Department of Military Sciences, the DMS, their whole operational profile is to stop groups with exotic, science threats. So there are combination science geeks and rapid response, first team shooters.
Great. So it's a combination of action and also kind of scientific extrapolation as well.
Yes, a lot of it's based on what is actually happening right now in science. It's just a little bit forward of what we can do now, but not beyond what is possible, and unfortunately what is probable.
Gotcha. At the outset, I discussed your novels, including Ghost Road Blues, your first novel that won the Bram Stoker Award. But you've also written nonfiction, including Vampire Universe, Zombie CSU, and others. I wonder, what is it about supernatural zombies and monsters that appeal to you? And more importantly, what do you think appeals to readers, why they appeal to readers?
Well, my background is nonfiction. I was a nonfiction guy for the first 25 years of my career, writing magazine articles and textbooks and all sorts of things. But my love of the supernatural goes back to my childhood. I had a very, very spooky grandmother. She believed in what she called the larger world. She believed in vampires and ghosts and pretty much all of the supernatural things she believed that made up the world in which we live. So that's what I learned about before I even read fiction, before I saw horror movies. I was learning about that viewpoint. And whereas I don't believe quite everything that she believed, it's left me with an extremely open mind and a very curious one. So I've always been fascinated by the belief systems that people have, where they're similar, where they're different, and how many beliefs there are around the world. So after spending a lot of years doing other types of writing, in 2001 I decided to take a swing at writing a book that would explore belief systems on things like vampires and werewolves around the world and throughout history. And it was because of that early book, it changed my career from predominantly writing martial arts articles and martial arts books to being a horror guy for quite a while, and now a thriller guy.
And what was that book?
That was called The Vampire Slayer's Field Guide to the Undead, and it was the only book I've ever written under a pen name. It was written under the name of Shane MacDougall, MacDougall being my middle name and Shane being the Scottish for John. The reason I used the pen name, my publisher, I was with a small press at the time, And that publisher was afraid that if my martial arts readers saw that I was writing about vampires, they would think I'd, had some sort of a neurological accident. So he asked me to use a pen name. I had just gotten into the Martial Arts Hall of Fame, so he was trying to protect my reputation. Turns out the martial arts readers loved the vampire book, and they figured who it was. So, there we go.
Great. Well, I'm curious about that. What was the path to publication for you? You mentioned that you spent all of these years writing nonfiction, and then you just described your transition from what was nonfiction about martial arts to the transition to writing about monsters and the supernatural. I'm curious about, had you always been interested in writing, or were you first interested in martial arts and then decided to write about it? And I was also curious, kind of along those same lines, when you were writing the nonfiction, were you always did you always have the idea of writing fiction, or were you trying fiction even then?
Well, I've always wanted to write. I mean, I can't remember a time in my life when I didn't want to be a storyteller. In fact, I remember very clearly in third grade when they asked us what we wanted to be when we grew up. Most of the kids were like fireman, nurse, cop. I said storyteller. So it's always been what I've wanted to do. I got involved in martial arts when I was a little kid, but I'd already started. Already been telling stories using. Before I could write, I used toys to tell stories. So I was always a storyteller. When I went to college, I went to Temple University. At the time, they did not have any creative writing programs. So I wound up taking the only writing programs I could, which was journalism. And that kind of steered me in the path of nonfiction for quite a bit. I've sold about 1,200 magazine feature articles and quite a few columns. And I've written all sorts of stuff. I got some very good early advice that I shouldn't lock myself into one kind of writing. So I've done plays, I've done greeting cards, song lyrics, short stories, a little bit of everything. However, it was after I'd written those my first two nonfiction books on folklore that I got the idea to try fiction. And I never really thought that I would become a novelist. That wasn't part of my game plan. But I figured, why not? And what inspired it was I was writing about these bizarre variations on the vampire myth and wondering why nobody in fiction really tackled that. Most of the vampires that we see in fiction are retreads of the Dracula myth. And, when Bram Stoker did Dracula, he veered quite a bit away from folklore and even got some of his research wrong. So I decided I wanted to write the kind of folklorically inspired fiction that I myself would go out and buy. So I wrote the book. I wrote a novel that I would read. I had no idea it would even sell, and that was Ghost Road Blues.
Gotcha. That's an interesting path to publication. And during the time when you were writing nonfiction, were you reading fiction? Were you a big reader?
It's funny thing about that. Most people I know who write nonfiction don't read fiction, but I've always read fiction. Mm-hmm. I've been reading. I remember when I was 8 years old, I bought my first novel, which was Conan the Wanderer, and I still have it. And I grew up reading the Ed McBain and John D. MacDonald books, all of Edgar Rice Burroughs, Doc Savage. I grew up reading everything I can get my hands on, and that itself was a little strange because I came from an environment, a very poor section of Philadelphia, very blue-collar section, where reading and education were not heavily encouraged, and it was not encouraged within my own family. Mm-hmm. But I had to read, and I just read. And luckily, my grandmother was very much into reading, and she would let me keep my books at her house and was always encouraging me to read. When I was 14, I was lucky enough to meet a couple of very famous writers, Richard Matheson and Ray Bradbury, and they gave me a tremendous amount of encouragement and advice. And both of them said, if you want to be a writer, don't let anything stop you, and nothing has.
And how did that meeting come about? How did that happen?
It's funny. I was in a middle school in Philly that did not have a high academic standard, and the English class had bored me to tears. So they put me they gave me to the librarian, and they said, "Here, do something with him for a couple of years." And so I had been almost an independent study for a couple of years with this librarian. And she was the secretary for a group of professional science fiction and fantasy writers that met occasionally in Philadelphia. And she dragged me along to the meetings. And at the time, I had been reading mostly crime fiction, so I really didn't know some of these guys. And this is so here I am at 14 years old, and I'm basically hustling beers and chips for Arthur C. Clarke and Ray Bradbury and Harlan Ellison and guys like that. And they're all competing to try to get me to be the one, competing with each other for me to fall in love with their books. And so every time I'd come, they'd have a stack of signed books for me. And I mean, it was amazing. I look back on it now, and I wish I'd even asked them more questions than I did. But they were so insanely generous with their advice and their support, and just good guys. They were really good people. It was marvelous.
That's great. That's a wonderful story. I'm curious about martial arts because, to be honest with you, I was aware of your work. I had bought Ghost Road Blues when it came out, and picked up Patient Zero, and we had traded emails when Patient Zero came out about doing an interview, and now we're finally getting around to it. But when I started doing research for interviewing you, I discovered this martial arts background, which I had never known, and I'm curious about that. When did you originally get interested in martial arts? You mentioned earlier that it was at a young age, and I know that you're in the Martial Arts Hall of Fame. I'm just curious if you could talk about that and your experience in martial arts.
Sure. I actually got involved in martial arts because I was in a fairly abusive environment as a kid, and the father of a friend of mine dragged me along to some lessons. It was one of those things where abuse wasn't talked about in the early 60s, but this friend's father dragged me to the martial arts school. Didn't necessarily mention it too much to my parents, and so around the time I was 6 or 7, I was just when I was starting school, I was also going to martial arts classes, and I stayed with it long past the point when I needed it for protection at home, so to speak. Mm-hmm. And I've been practicing jiu-jitsu for about 46 years now. And I wound up teaching martial arts history and women's self-defense at Temple University for 14 years. And I've written extensively about it. I've been a teacher for many years. And I even had a business for a while called CopSafe, where we gave arrest and control workshops to law enforcement officers of all kinds, including SWAT. And that was, it's been an interesting career. Most of my life, I've been, directly or actively involved in teaching martial arts in one kind or another, and self-defense, which is some people don't realize is not quite the same thing as martial arts.
Right. That's interesting because, as you probably may know, Joe Lansdale,
yes,
horror writer or beyond horror writer, just writer, is a martial artist, and
yes.
I'm curious if you ever have thought about if you feel there's been any kind of connection between the martial arts and writing, whether it's persistence and teaching you persistence, or maybe I'm just saying that. Do you feel there's been any kind of connections?
Oh, absolutely. Martial arts is a remarkably wonderful thing for teaching discipline, for teaching focus, and for cutting right through it and getting, finding out what it is you need to say or do and getting it done. I credit my martial arts training as one of the most significant factors in my writing career. It taught me to do it and get it done, and to stick with it. After all those years in martial arts, I'm not a big one for giving up on something before it's done. And with the writing business, before I was successful, I was just another one of those guys who was struggling and not knowing whether all that work was going to pay off. If I didn't have the discipline and didn't have the experience with continuing to try to not be deterred, I might have given up. And figure I didn't become a full-time successful writer until about 6 years ago. Before that I was working day jobs and writing on the side. If I didn't have something that kept me going and gave me confidence, I might have given up before my break happened. And life would have been a lot different and a lot less pleasant had that happened.
Interesting. So I wanted to talk about your work in comics. You mentioned earlier reading crime fiction, and you're writing for Marvel Comics now. I mentioned earlier you're writing the Black Panther series. I'm curious, as a kid, were you also reading comics as well? I mean, were you reading Marvel and DC back then?
Yeah, I was a Marvel guy from the beginning. When I was 8 years old, 1966, I walked into a comic book store and picked up Fantastic Four number 68. That was my first comic, and I thought it was, wow, this is cool. You know, I'd seen other kids read comics, and I'd read Archie comics, but I hadn't read superhero comics.
Right.
And there were 12 cents a piece, and I was 8 years old, and I'd actually helped. I made a few dollars bagging groceries, unofficial job at the Acme. And I went and spent it on some comics. And I was absolutely captivated. This is the old Jack Kirby, Stan Lee, Fantastic Four. And around that time, I started buying up some back issues and anything new that came out. And one of the ironies is one of the characters that was introduced around that time was the Black Panther. He was introduced first in Fantastic Four, and he was also the very first black superhero in comics ever. Now, I'm living in a neighborhood that is fiercely racist, white racist, and here I'm reading about a character who's a black superhero. I'm like, wow, that's really pretty amazing. That isn't the sort of information I'm hearing about blacks from my own neighborhood. And then a couple of years later, they did a Fantastic Four comic about apartheid. Nobody talked about that. This is 1971 now. So I learned about apartheid, from a comic book. So a lot of what I learned about values, either I got from martial arts or I got from superhero comics. And the funny thing is, Marvel didn't know about my having learned about apartheid from Fantastic Four and Black Panther when they offered me the Black Panther comic. It was just one of those happy coincidences that makes my grandmother's belief in the larger world seem very, very likely.
And how did that happen? How did you get offered the work in comics? Was it something that you were pitching along with writing novels, or was that an offer that came from Marvel?
It came from Marvel, but I was planning to pitch. I was discussing with my agent how to pitch to comics, because I knew some other guys who had just started writing for comics, and I wanted in on that because that sounded too much fun. But none of them had actually pitched. They'd been approached, and I was trying. I hadn't yet been approached. I'm thinking, all right, well, how do I get my foot in the door? Well, it turns out the editor at St. Martin's who edited Patient Zero sent that book to Marvel, and the editor at Marvel, Axel Alonso, read it and liked what he saw, and then I got a phone call one day. It was one of those weird things. I get a phone call, and it's Axel Alonso, an executive editor at Marvel, asking if I'd be interested in writing for Marvel. And it was such an absurd question. It's like, are you freaking kidding me here? And I said, yeah, I think I might be interested, possibly. And
you need to talk to my agent.
Yeah, well, it's one of those things that I'm experienced enough now in my craft that I always tell them to talk to my agent, and I'm glad this is happening on the phone, because physically I'm doing the Snoopy dance.
Yeah, exactly.
But my voice on the phone is, of course, calm, controlled, and my agent worked out the details, and we were all happy with the arrangement. And Axel, asked me to write it was a Punisher comic originally, one shot, and I did that. And then they gave me a Wolverine 8-pager to do, backup story. And then right after that, they said, well, how would you like to be the regular writer for Black Panther? It's like, that's the second stupidest question I've ever been asked after, would you like to write for Marvel?
Yeah. And so what are you working on in terms of comics? I mean, outside of the Black Panther, what can people look for?
Well, the Black Panther is kind of put on hold now because we're doing Doom War, which spun off of that. It's a six-issue limited series where the Fantastic Four, X-Men, Deadpool, and 2 Black Panthers, the original one and his sister, who's the current Black Panther, go to war against Dr. Doom. And I'm in the middle of writing that right now. And the first issue just sold out, and it's getting great reception. So I'm writing that, and I'm also writing something called Marvel Infected, which is a limited series that starts in August that deals with the Punisher and Spider-Man and a few other characters in a kind of a dystopian alternate future. And it's very gritty and very bizarre and very violent. I'm having a blast writing that. So those are the two projects I'm doing for Marvel at the moment.
So I'm curious if someone's listening to this podcast and primarily the writers that I've interviewed in the past are fiction writers. Primarily suspense, thrillers, fantasy, science fiction, and mainly novels. I'm curious if you could talk a little bit about the process of writing a comic book, just in terms of the mechanics. Is it similar to movie scripts? Would that be the closest description?
Movie or TV. Yeah, movie or TV. It is definitely a scripted format, and it's a collaborative process. Unlike a novel where it's your entire vision, every part of it's your vision. In comics, you're part of a team, and you can't let your ego get too overbearing, because the artist is going to have his say. The inker, the penciler, the inker, the editor, everyone's going to have some say in the way the comic turns out, as it should be, because you're writing someone else's product. I didn't invent the Black Panther. I didn't invent Punisher. I'm coming in to work in their house, so to speak.
Sure.
So the process is, the editor usually, if the editor has a certain thing in mind, he may say, I need a story for such and such. Like with Marvel Zombies Return, I was writing issue 3 of a 5-issue series, and they told me in a very short paragraph what the story had to accomplish, and then they wanted me to pitch back to them how I would do that in 22 pages. So I do what's called a beat sheet, which lays out how the story would break down over 22 pages. Editor comes back with notes, and then you write the script. And in the script, the writer tells the artist what the images are going to be. The writer sets the number of panels. The writer decides what images are in each panel, and you write that description, and then you also write the script itself. Used to be in Marvel that it was kind of way long ago that the artist would draw it, and then the writer would come in and put the word balloons in. Well, that hasn't happened in a long time. The writer actually has to write the script. However, the editor may make some changes, and then the artist may make suggestions for changing the visual storytelling, because that's his A game. And if you're smart, you listen to a good artist, because they know what visually will tell the story as well. So you're back and forth with them a little bit to create the most successful possible comic. And I've been fortunate enough to work with some fantastic artists, and I have a very, very good editor in Axel Alonso. He has a very strong vision. In fact, he's now vice president at Marvel. Just got promoted, and he has a very strong vision for what makes a successful comic. And that's something that's all you do have in novels as well. If you have a really good editor, you can have a more successful book, because they're not telling you how to write, but they can make suggestions on how to revise the book to make it the most saleable possible product. And this is a business.
Gotcha. That's interesting. I'm curious, given your career, as we've talked about, both in nonfiction and your transition to fiction and branching into comic books, what advice, when you're doing speaking engagements and presentations, what advice do you give aspiring writers and people who may be interested in having a career in fiction?
Well, the most important things, and I do a lot of these talks with aspiring writers, and I run some writers groups for people who are trying to break in. Most important thing is it's got to be fun. If it's not fun, if it looks like it's hard work, if it feels like it's hard work, it's going to read like it's hard work. So you've got to have fun, and the best way to have fun is don't write to please anyone, write to please yourself. Write the story that you would have the most fun reading. So the writer writes for his inner reader. That way the story is honest, and it's going to be clear that you're having fun while writing it. So that's one bit of advice. Second, with writers, too many of the writers I know who have really good stories give up because they get trapped in this revision thing. They're trying to write a first draft as if it's a final draft. And you can't. Nobody can. The first draft is all about story, and it's a separate part of the brain than the craft, than the part of you that goes in there and pretties it up. Craft can be learned. Storytelling, you're either born with or not. So you let the storyteller do his thing, and you do it completely, all the way to the end, to the final word of the first draft. You buy yourself a present and celebrate the fact you finished the first draft, and then, and only then, you go back and revise. That way, you're playing to your strengths, but in stages. And I know so many folks who get about a third of the way through the book, and they think that they need to go back and rewrite it, and they get caught in a loop that never ends. And as a result, they don't get a good piece of writing out, or they don't complete anything.
Gotcha. I'm curious, who are some of the writers that you enjoy reading?
Oh boy, that's a long list, because I read in a lot of different genres. And also there are a lot of friends of mine who are writers, and I read everything they write, and to some degree that's how we've become friends. John Connolly, James Lee Burke, I'll snatch any book they put out the second it's out. I think they're two of the finest writers we have right now. They're a nice balance of lyrical and good storytelling and craftsmanship. Just fantastic stuff. Love John Sanford. Really love especially his Virgil Flowers series. I just recently got into S.M. Sterling's books, the alternate history books, and I found the research on those fascinating. But there are some, I'm still a fan of Matheson and Bradbury and those guys. Joe Lansdale, you mentioned him earlier. I love his Hap Collins, Leonard Pine books. Absolutely gobble them up. And they're just, I could do this all night talking about my favorite writers. I have
exactly
a stack of books that I'm just now trying to get to. And those I can't read in print, I get on disc to listen to them on disc. So I'm always gobbling up tons and tons of great writers out there. And I tell you, it's wonderful that almost everyone I read, I know. And that's a fantastic thing. It's something new now that I'm a novelist.
That's great. James Lee Burke is wonderful. And a lot of the others that you mentioned as well.
Oh, yeah. And David Morrell, Lee Child. There's so many great writers out there.
Yeah. So what's up next for you? I mentioned earlier your latest novel, The Dragon Factory, is in bookstores now. What can we look for next?
Yeah, it's good. It's actually a pretty busy year. The Wolfman just came out, and I'm going to be doing a bunch of short stories I'm doing, and will be coming. Some are coming out in the anthologies. One just came out in the New Dead, an anthology of zombie stories. I have a story called Family Business. But next up is a nonfiction book called Wanted, Undead, or Alive, which is about all the people in folklore and in the real world who hunt evil. Everything from vampire hunters to FBI profilers who hunt serial killers. And that was co-written with Janice Gable Bashman, and it includes interviews with everyone from John Carpenter to Stan Lee to forensic psychologists. That's a fun book. That'll be in August. In September, I have my first young adult novel called Rot and Ruin. And that is already getting a lot of buzz, including a lot of movie interest. Set 14
Rot and Ruin?
Rot and Ruin. It's set 14 years after the zombie apocalypse, but it's not really a horror novel. It's more of a coming-of-age story set after the apocalypse. And it's launching a new series, and it'll actually be launched at Dragon Con down in Atlanta. But it'll be in hardback from Simon & Schuster everywhere in September. And I'm also literally waiting on word right now about a TV adaptation of my Joe Ledger series. And it was optioned by Sony for TV, and apparently things are going nicely, but can't share details yet, but it looks like things are going nicely.
Sure. And, so your young adult novel, that sounds, at first when I read a description of it, I thought it might be humorous, but you said coming of age. It sounds like it's more of a, I guess, serious,
there's a lot of serious stuff in it, and even, Publishers Weekly called it heartbreaking, but there's also a lot of humor. There's actually a lot of humor in everything I write. I'm kind of a smartass, so it kind of leaks through in my writing. I always like the wisecracking hero, and I just seem to put a lot of my own sense of humor in my books. Joe Ledger's definitely has a lot of humor to it, even though it's pretty serious stuff. And Rotten Ruin has everything from comedy to tragedy in the book, and it was a lot of fun to write.
Great. Well, that sounds like a lot of fun. And again, that's Rot and Ruin. And you said that'll be out in August?
It'll be out September 7th in hardback.
September 7th.
Simon & Schuster.
Great.
And I just finished the third Joe Ledger novel, and that'll be out next year, King of Plagues.
King of Plagues?
Mm-hmm.
Great. Well, again, we've been speaking with Jonathan Maberry, horror author, thriller writer, comic book writer. Maberry's latest novel is The Dragon Factory, in bookstores now. And you can also find out a lot more about Maberry at his big scary blog at jonathanmaberry.com, where he also features interviews with other suspense, thriller, and novelists. So, again, thanks, Jonathan.
Thank you. This has been a lot of fun. And I'm a big fan of your blog anyway. I've listened. I think I've listened to all 20 or 21 of your podcasts so far.
Oh, wow. Thanks a lot.
Great stuff.
This is David Morrell, and when I'm not working on my latest thriller, I'm listening to the Reading and Writing Podcast.
Thanks for listening to my latest interview. If you like what you heard, I would really appreciate a review of the podcast in iTunes. It's really simple. All you have to do is go to the iTunes store, and it takes a minute or two to leave a quick review of the podcast. And that way more people can find the podcast, because the more reviews and ratings a podcast has in the iTunes store, the more they feature it and the more prominently they feature it. So hope you enjoyed the interview. Until next time, read some good books and support your local independent bookstore, and I'll be back soon with another interview with a writer that you enjoy reading.
With MailChimp, you get more than a URL. You get an all-in-one marketing platform to help drive sales, with things like data-driven recommendations and powerful automation tools. Get started today at MailChimp.com/smartmarketing. MailChimp, built for growing businesses.
Back to school season is here, and summer is still going strong. Visit Wetco to protect your car's paint from bugs and damage caused by UV rays. Ceramic wax keeps it shiny. If you're a teacher, student, or school staff, we'll give you 50% off a car wash between now and September 11th. Just show your school ID in store, or sign up for unlimited washes and cram in all the washes you want for one monthly price starting at $14.99 per month. Go back to school at your brightest. Visit getgocafe.com/unlimited today.